On the 1st of August 1834, across the British Empire, more than 800,000 enslaved people were told they were free. Church bells rang, people wept and prayed and danced through the night. It's still marked today, Emancipation Day, across the Caribbean and beyond. But there's a part of that story you were almost certainly never taught. When Britain ended slavery, it paid out one of the largest sums in its history in compensation. It just didn't pay it to the people who had been enslaved. It paid it to the people who had owned them. And the debt Britain took on to do it was so large that it wasn't finally cleared until the year 2015. Which means that within the last decade, British taxpayers were still, in a quiet accounting sense, paying off the money used to compensate slave owners. This is the true story of how Britain freed 800,000 people and paid the wrong ones. Let's get into it. Let's start with the day itself, the 1st of August, 1834. The year before, after decades of campaigning by abolitionists in Britain and, just as importantly, by enslaved people themselves, who rebelled and resisted again and again, Parliament passed a law to end slavery across most of the British Empire. And on the 1st of August, 1834, it came into force. More than 800,000 people in the Caribbean, in southern Africa, on islands across the Indian Ocean were declared free. Imagine that night. In Jamaica, in Barbados, in Antigua, people gathered in churches and fields to wait for midnight. When it came, there was weeping and prayer and dancing until dawn. And people marked it every year after. They still do. It's called Emancipation Day, and it's remembered across the Caribbean, in Canada, and in Britain to this day. It's a real milestone, and it deserves every bit of its celebration. But the word free was doing a lot of quiet work that day, because freedom, the way Britain designed it, came with two catches, and almost nobody is taught either one. Here's the first catch. On the 1st of August, 1834, most of those 800,000 people did not actually walk away free. The law came with a system that had a gentle-sounding name: apprenticeship. In practice, it meant the newly freed people were required to keep working, unpaid, for the very same people who had enslaved them, for up to another 4 years. Same plantations, same owners, same labor, just given a new label. So the freedom of 1834 was for most a freedom on paper, with the real chains loosened slowly, over years. It wasn't until 1838, after protest and mounting pressure, that apprenticeship was finally scrapped and full freedom actually arrived. 4 more years of unpaid work taken from people who had already given their whole lives. And through all of it, the formerly enslaved received one thing for their stolen years: nothing, not a coin. Which raises the obvious question, because a vast amount of money did change hands when slavery ended. If none of it went to them, where did it go? Here's the second catch, and it's the one that tends to stop people cold. When Britain abolished slavery, it agreed to pay compensation, a great deal of it, £20 million. But the money didn't go to the people who had been enslaved to help them build new lives. It went to the people who had owned them, as compensation for the loss of their property. The human beings were the property, and when they were freed, the state paid their owners for the loss. Now let me give you a sense of the scale, because £20 million in 1834 can sound almost quaint. It was anything but. It came to around 40% of the entire British government's budget for the year, roughly £1 in every 2.5 that the whole state spent. It was one of the largest payouts the British government had ever made, and it went in more than 40,000 separate awards to slave owners. And thanks to a huge research project at University College London, we now know precisely who those owners were. The money flowed to thousands of British families, some obscure, some names you would still recognize, and into fortunes and institutions that are still with us. Wealth made from enslaved people quietly became respectable family money, country houses, investments, inheritances, laundered clean through a government check. So set the two halves side by side. The people who were enslaved, freed slowly, made to work years more for free, paid nothing. The people who enslaved them paid a national fortune in cash upfront. That isn't a small footnote to the story. That's the whole moral machinery of it, running exactly backwards. And now the part that lifts all of this out of the history books and drops it into living memory. £20 million was such a staggering sum that the government couldn't simply pay it out of hand. It had to borrow the money. A loan so large it was among the biggest the country had ever taken on. And here's where it gets strange. That debt wasn't paid off in a few years. It got rolled over, folded into the government's ordinary borrowing, and eventually into a special kind of government bond with no fixed end date. The sort that just keeps going, paying interest until the government one day chooses to cancel it. The government chose to cancel that batch of very old debt in the year 2015, which means that by the Treasury's own confirmation, British taxpayers only finished paying off the borrowing used to compensate slave owners in 2015, within the last decade. Now, I want to be careful here, because this fact gets stretched online, and getting it exactly right is the whole point of a channel like this. It does not mean the original 20 million sat there untouched and unpaid for 180 years. That debt was blended into the government's wider borrowing long ago, so you can't say the whole sum was outstanding the entire time. What is true, and what the Treasury has confirmed, is this. The borrowing raised to fund that compensation was wrapped up in bonds that weren't finally cleared until 2015. So in a real, if tangled sense, taxpayers were still servicing that debt within the last 10 years. And here's the part that stays with you. Among those British taxpayers, paying into the pot that was still, on paper, settling the slave owners' compensation were the children and grandchildren of the people who had been enslaved. They helped pay off the debt Britain took on to compensate the men who had once owned their ancestors. The bill for slavery, quietly passed to the descendants of the enslaved, right up until about 10 years ago. So, when the 1st of August comes round, and Emancipation Day with it, what are we actually marking? Something real, first of all. The end of legal slavery across the empire, won by campaigners, and above all, by the resistance of enslaved people who never once accepted their chains. That freedom mattered. It's worth every bell that was rung for it. But the fuller story tells you what a society truly values by looking at who it chooses to pay. Britain freed 800,000 people, made them work years more for nothing, and then wrote its largest check to the people who had held them. For a long time, that second half was simply left out. It's only in the last few years, through work like University College London's database and historians like David Olusoga, that it's being pulled back into the light, where it belongs. Emancipation Day is worth celebrating. It's also worth understanding all the way down, because the people who were owed the most were the only ones who got nothing. If you want the history underneath the dates, the parts that got left out, this channel is where I dig it up. I'll see you in the next one.